Behind the golden gates of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal secrets have been buried beneath polished marble and whispered conversations, a single moment would shatter the carefully constructed facade of Britain's most powerful family. What started as a routine security check on a crisp October morning would uncover a truth so devastating that it would force a future king to question everything he thought he knew about the woman who had become his stepmother. The discovery hidden in the depths of a seemingly innocent vehicle would not only expose decades of deception, but would also reveal a web of lies that reached into the very heart of the monarchy itself. This is the story of how Prince William's world came crashing down when he finally learned the truth about Queen Camilla, and how a single confrontation would forever change the course of royal history. Some secrets are too dangerous to remain buried forever. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the fortress that had stood as a symbol of British power for nearly 1,000 years.
Dinner observing to browser.
Prince William stood at the tall windows of his private office, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the ground slowly emerge from the October fog. At 41 years old, he had learned to find solace in these quiet moments before the day's responsibilities consumed him entirely. The weight of his future crown seemed heavier these days, especially since his father's coronation had made the succession feel more real than ever. King Charles III had settled into his role with the dignity expected of a monarch, but William could see the toll that decades of waiting had taken on him. The new king's relationship with Queen Camilla had finally found acceptance among the British people.
Though William knew that acceptance had come at a great cost.
His phone buzzed against the mahogany desk, pulling him from his contemplation. The caller ID showed Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews, the head of Royal Security. William frowned as he answered. Sarah rarely called directly unless there was something serious to discuss. Your Royal Highness, I apologize for the early hour. Sarah's voice carried an unusual tension that immediately put William on alert.
We have a situation that requires your immediate attention.
Could you meet me in the security office within the next few minutes? William glanced at his schedule, which showed a breakfast meeting with the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 30 minutes.
What kind of situation, Sarah?
Can it wait until after my morning appointments? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and William could almost hear Sarah choosing her words carefully.
I'm afraid not, sir. I'm afraid not, sir.
This concerns Queen Camilla's vehicle from yesterday evening. We've discovered something during our routine security sweep that requires immediate attention from a senior member of the family. The formal tone in Sarah's voice sent a chill down William's spine. In all his years of working with the security team, he had never heard such careful restraint in the detective inspector's words. Sarah Matthews was known for her directness and efficiency. This diplomatic language meant trouble. I'll be there in 5 minutes, William replied, already moving toward the door. The walk through the castle's corridors felt longer than usual. William's mind raced through possibilities, each scenario more troubling than the last. Security sweeps of royal vehicles were routine procedures designed to ensure that no tracking devices, explosives, or other threats had been planted. The fact that something had been found in Camilla's car that warranted his personal attention suggested this was far more serious than a standard security concern. The Royal Security Office occupied a modern wing of the castle that had been renovated in the 1990s, with state-of-the-art technology. Despite the ancient stone walls, the interior resembled something from a spy thriller, with multiple monitors displaying feeds from cameras positioned throughout the castle grounds and beyond. Sarah Matthews stood at the central desk, her usually immaculate uniform slightly wrinkled as if she had been working through the night. Your Royal Highness, thank you for coming so quickly, Sarah began, gesturing toward a private conference room adjacent to the main security center. What I'm about to show you is extremely sensitive. I've limited access to only myself and 2 of my most trusted officers. William followed her into the conference room, noting how she carefully closed the door and activated a device that would prevent electronic surveillance. The level of precaution was unprecedented in his experience with palace security. On the conference table sat a sealed evidence bag containing what appeared to be a small digital device, no larger than a deck of cards. Beside it lay several photographs and a stack of documents. Sarah gestured for William to take a seat before positioning herself across from him. During last night's routine security sweep of Queen Camilla's Range Rover, we discovered this device hidden beneath the rear passenger seat. Sarah began, indicating the bag.
Initially, we assumed it might be a tracking device planted by paparazzi or someone with malicious intent.
However, when our technical team examined it more closely, we discovered it's actually a sophisticated digital storage device. William leaned forward, studying the innocuous-looking device. Storage for what? Sarah's expression grew even more serious.
Audio recording, sir.
Hundreds of hours of conversations that appear to have been secretly recorded over the past several years. The device was programmed to activate automatically whenever certain keywords were spoken in the vehicle. The implications began to sink in, and William felt his stomach tighten. Whose conversations? Based on our preliminary review, the recordings include conversations between Queen Camilla and various individuals, including journalists, private secretaries, and several people whose identities we're still working to confirm. Sarah replied carefully. The device appears to have been recording continuously for approximately 3 years. William sat back in his chair, trying to process this information. The idea that Camilla had been secretly recording conversations in her own vehicle suggested either that she was being surveilled without her knowledge, or worse, that she was actively participating in some form of covert recording operation. Have you listened to any of these recordings? William asked. Sarah nodded grimly. We've reviewed several hours of material to assess the potential security implications.
Do you hold a load of crime?
Sir, I must tell you that some of these recordings contain discussions that could be extremely damaging to the royal family if they were ever made public. The detective inspector reached for one of the documents on the table. This is a transcript of a conversation recorded just 2 weeks ago. Queen Camilla was speaking with someone identified only as Margaret about various members of the royal family, including yourself and the Princess of Wales. William's hands felt cold as he took the transcript. Reading Camilla's words, even on paper, felt like a violation. But the content made his blood run cold. The conversation revealed intimate details about the royal family's private lives, including Catherine's struggles with public scrutiny, George's academic challenges, and William's own concerns about his father's health. Most shocking of all were Camilla's disparaging comments about Diana's legacy and her obvious satisfaction at having finally achieved the position she had long desired.
This conversation took place in her private vehicle?
William asked, his voice carefully controlled. Yes, sir. The technical analysis suggests the recording device was positioned to capture conversations between the driver and passengers, as well as any phone calls made through the vehicle's hands-free system. Sarah explained. We've also discovered that many of these recordings contain discussions with individuals who appear to be journalists or media representatives. William set down the transcript, his mind reeling. The woman his father had married, the woman who now bore the title of Queen Consort, had apparently been conducting what amounted to a private intelligence operation from her own vehicle. The recording suggested not only that she was sharing confidential information about the royal family, but that she might be actively collaborating with media outlets. How certain are we that Queen Camilla was aware of this device? William asked. Sarah's expression was grim. Based on the content of the conversations and the way she appears to position herself to ensure clear audio quality, we believe she was not only aware of the device, but was actively using it for the purpose of documenting these conversations. The reality of the situation began to crystallize for William. This wasn't a case of someone spying on Camilla. This was evidence that Camilla herself had been conducting covert surveillance operations, potentially for years.
I did say that fake Bearcast from Miami bad down the dark bar.
The recordings represented a massive security breach and a betrayal of trust that went to the very heart of the royal family.
What's our next step? William asked, though he dreaded the answer.
That depends on your instructions, sir, Sarah replied. From a security standpoint, we need to conduct a full investigation to determine the extent of any information that may have been compromised. We also need to establish whether Queen Camilla has been sharing this information with unauthorized individuals and whether any of these recordings have already been distributed. William stood and walked to the window, looking out at the castle grounds where tourists were already beginning to gather for the morning tour.
These people believed in the dignity and honor of the royal institution. They trusted that the monarchy represented the best of British values and traditions. The idea that the Queen Consort herself might be undermining that trust from within was almost too devastating to contemplate.
I want a complete analysis of these recordings within 48 hours, William said finally. I want to know everyone she spoke with, every topic discussed, and any evidence of information being shared with outside parties. And Sarah? Yes, sir. This information stays between us until we understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. No one else is to know about this discovery until we decide how to proceed. Sarah nodded. Understood, sir. What about Queen Camilla herself? William turned back to face the detective inspector, his expression resolute.
Leave that to me.
I'll handle Queen Camilla personally.
As William left the security office, his mind was already racing ahead to the confrontation that now seemed inevitable.
The woman who had worked so hard to gain acceptance as his father's wife and as a member of the royal family had apparently been systematically betraying that trust. The recordings represented not just a personal betrayal, but a potential threat to the stability of the monarchy itself.
Walking back through the ancient corridors of Windsor Castle, William felt the weight of history pressing down on him. These walls had witnessed countless royal dramas, scandals, and betrayals over the centuries, but this felt different. This wasn't just about personal relationships or private indiscretions. This was about the fundamental trust that held the institution together. The breakfast meeting with the Chancellor seemed trivial now in comparison to what lay ahead. William would need to plan his approach carefully. Confronting Camilla directly would be necessary, but it would also be dangerous. If she had been recording conversations for years, she might have contingency plans in place. She might even be recording their confrontation itself. As he reached his office, William's private secretary looked up expectantly. "Sir, the Chancellor's office called to confirm your breakfast meeting. Shall I have them escorted up when they arrive?" William paused, considering his options. Maintaining normal routines would be important while he processed this information and planned his next moves. "Yes, please proceed as scheduled. But clear my calendar for this afternoon. I have some urgent family matters to attend to."
The irony wasn't lost on him. Family matters indeed.
The woman who had become his stepmother, who wore the crown that many believed should have belonged to his mother, who had finally achieved the acceptance and respect she had sought for decades, had apparently been working against the very family she claimed to serve. William sat at his desk and opened his laptop, beginning to compose a carefully worded message to his private secretary about arranging a meeting with Queen Camilla.
The message would need to seem routine while ensuring that they would have complete privacy for their conversation. He couldn't afford to have their discussion recorded or interrupted.
As he typed, William thought about his father. King Charles had waited his entire life to ascend to the throne, and his happiness with Camilla had been one of the few bright spots in his journey to that goal. The revelation about the recordings would devastate him not just personally but professionally.
A scandal of this magnitude could seriously damage the monarchy's reputation, at a time when Charles was still establishing himself as king. There was also the question of what Camilla intended to do with these recordings. Were they simply her way of keeping detailed records, or was there a more sinister purpose? The fact that many conversations involved journalists suggested she might be building relationships with media figures, possibly as leverage or insurance. The implications were staggering. William's phone rang again, this time showing Catherine's number. His wife would be wondering about his early morning departure from their residence at Adelaide Cottage. How could he possibly explain to her that his stepmother had potentially been recording private conversations about their family for years? "Good morning, darling." Catherine's cheerful voice provided a stark contrast to the dark thoughts occupying William's mind.
The children were asking about breakfast with Daddy.
"Will you be back before they leave for school?"
I'm afraid not, William replied, hating that he had to maintain this facade while such a serious situation was unfolding.
"I've had some urgent matters come up that need immediate attention. Kiss them for me and tell them I'll see them this evening." Is everything all right? Catherine's intuitive nature had always been both a blessing and a challenge. She could sense when something was troubling him, even when he tried to hide it. "Everything's fine," William lied, hoping his voice sounded more convincing than he felt. "Just some tedious administrative issues that couldn't wait. I'll explain more when I see you tonight." After ending the call, William stared at the phone in his hand. How many conversations with Catherine had taken place in vehicles where Camilla was present? How many private family discussions had been recorded without their knowledge? The violation felt deeply personal, but he knew he needed to approach this situation strategically rather than emotionally. The clock on his desk showed 8:30. The Chancellor would arrive soon, and William would need to maintain his composure through what would likely be a difficult discussion about economic policy and governmental affairs. But his mind would be focused on the afternoon ahead, and the confrontation that would determine not only his relationship with Camilla, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. The morning mist had finally cleared from the castle grounds, revealing the crisp autumn landscape beyond. But for William, the fog of uncertainty was just beginning to settle over what had once seemed like a clear path forward. The recordings had changed everything, and there was no going back to the way things were before Sarah Matthews had made that devastating phone call. As he prepared for his meeting with the Chancellor, William couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. If Camilla had been secretly recording conversations for years, what other secrets might be hidden in the depths of the royal family's private world? And more importantly,
What would she be willing to do to protect those secrets once she realized they had been discovered?
The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the private dining room at Clarence's house as William waited for Camilla to arrive.
He had chosen this location carefully, neutral territory where both of them would feel comfortable, but also a space where he could control the environment.
The irony that he was meeting her in the house that had once belonged to his grandmother, the Queen Mother, was not lost on him. These walls had witnessed decades of royal conversations, but none quite like the one about to take place.
William had spent the morning reviewing more of the transcripts that Sarah Matthews had provided. Each conversation revealed additional layers of betrayal that made his chest tighten with a mixture of anger and disappointment.
The recordings showed a pattern that went far beyond casual indiscretion. Camilla had been systematically documenting private royal conversations, sharing intimate family details with journalists, and building what appeared to be an extensive network of media contacts who relied on her for exclusive information about the royal family's private lives. One conversation in particular had shaken William to his core. Recorded just 6 months earlier, it featured Camilla speaking with someone identified as Richard about William's children. She had shared details about Prince George's struggles with dyslexia, Princess Charlotte's fears about public appearances, and Prince Louis's behavioral challenges in school. These were deeply personal family matters that Camilla had learned about through casual family conversations, then systematically recorded and shared with what appeared to be a journalist contact. The betrayal felt deeply personal, but William knew he needed to approach this confrontation strategically. Camilla was intelligent and calculating, the recordings proved that much. She would likely have prepared for the possibility that her activities might eventually be discovered. William needed to be prepared for any scenario, including the possibility that she might try to turn this situation to her advantage somehow.
The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor announced Camilla's arrival.
William stood as she entered the dining room, noting her impeccable appearance despite the short notice for their meeting. Queen Camilla wore a navy blue dress with pearl accessories, projecting the image of dignified royalty that she had worked so hard to cultivate over the years. Her smile seemed genuine, but William now found himself analyzing every expression for signs of deception. "William, darling, how lovely to see you," Camilla said warmly, approaching to kiss him on both cheeks in their customary greeting. "I was surprised by your call, but I always have time for family. How are Catherine and the children?" The casual reference to his family made William's jaw tighten involuntarily. After what he had learned that morning, hearing Camilla ask about his wife and children felt like salt being poured into an open wound. He gestured for her to take a seat at the small round table that had been set with tea service. "They're well, thank you," William replied carefully, taking his own seat across from her. "Camilla, I asked you here because we need to discuss something rather serious. It concerns your security arrangements." Camilla's expression shifted slightly, showing the first hint of wariness. She reached for the teapot with steady hands, but William noticed a slight hesitation in her movement. "Security arrangements? Has something happened? Should I be concerned for my safety?" William studied her face carefully. Either Camilla was genuinely unaware that the recording device had been discovered, or she was an exceptionally skilled actress. Given what he now knew about her capacity for deception, he suspected the latter. "Yesterday evening, during the routine security sweep of your vehicle, our team discovered something unexpected."
William began, watching her reaction closely.
"They found a sophisticated recording device hidden in your Range Rover." The change in Camilla's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Her hand paused momentarily as she lifted her teacup, and William caught a brief flash of something that looked like panic in her eyes before her composed mask slipped back into place. "This is the book, it's about history." "A recording device? How extraordinary," Camilla said, setting down her cup with deliberate care. "Do they believe someone has been spying on me? That's rather concerning. I should think the security implications could be quite serious." William had expected this response, the assumption that she was a victim rather than a perpetrator. It was a clever strategy, but he had come prepared for it. "That was our initial assumption as well," William replied evenly. "However, upon further investigation, we discovered that the device contained hundreds of hours of recorded conversations. The technical analysis suggests it had been in place for approximately 3 years and was programmed to activate based on specific voice patterns and keywords." Camilla's face had gone slightly pale, but she maintained her composure. "How terrifying! To think that someone has been listening to my private conversations for so long. We must contact the police immediately. This is surely some form of criminal surveillance." William leaned forward slightly, his voice remaining calm but taking on a harder edge. "Camilla, the voice activation pattern was programmed to respond specifically to your voice. The device was positioned to capture conversations between you and your passengers, as well as any phone calls made through the vehicle's hands-free system. The technical evidence suggests that whoever placed this device had intimate knowledge of your routine and access to your vehicle. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Camilla set down her teacup and folded her hands in her lap, her composed expression never wavering. But William could see the calculation happening behind her eyes as she processed this information and formulated her next response.
I'm afraid I don't understand what you're implying, William, Camilla said finally.
Are you suggesting that I somehow arranged to have my own conversations recorded? That seems rather absurd. William reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folder containing several transcript pages. He placed it on the table between them, noting how Camilla's gaze immediately fixed on it.
These are transcripts of some of the recordings found on the device, William said quietly. They include conversations between you and various individuals, many of whom appear to be journalists or media representatives.
As UIS sailors, they broke the top of the top plane.
The conversations contained detailed discussions about private royal family matters, including intimate details about my children's personal struggles and my wife's private concerns.
Camilla's mask finally began to slip.
Her face flushed slightly, and for the first time since entering the room she appeared genuinely uncomfortable. She made no move to reach for the folder.
I speak with many people in the course of my royal duties, Camilla said carefully. Sometimes conversations naturally touch on family matters. I hardly think that constitutes some sort of conspiracy. William opened the folder and withdrew a specific transcript. This is from a conversation recorded on September 15th.
You were speaking with someone identified as Margaret about the challenges my father faces as a new monarch. In this conversation, you specifically mention his concerns about public opinion regarding your role as queen consort, and you discuss strategies for improving your public image through selective media engagement.
He continued reading. You also share details about a private family dinner where my father expressed doubts about certain governmental policies.
These are matters of national security, Camilla. They're not casual family anecdotes.
Camilla's composure was rapidly deteriorating. She reached for her teacup again, but her hand was visibly trembling now. I don't recall every casual conversation I've had over the past several years. If I mentioned anything inappropriate, it certainly wasn't intentional.
William placed the transcript back in the folder and fixed Camilla with a steady gaze. The recordings suggest otherwise. They show a clear pattern of systematically documenting and sharing confidential information about the royal family's private lives. Some of these conversations include explicit discussions about providing exclusive access to journalists in exchange for favorable coverage.
The accusation hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud.
William watched as various emotions flickered across Camilla's face. Anger, fear, calculation, and something that might have been resignation. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its warm grandmotherly tone and taken on a harder edge that William had rarely heard before.
You don't understand the pressures I face, William. Camilla said, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. I've spent decades being vilified by the press and the public.
Every move I make is scrutinized, every word analyzed for hidden meaning. I've had to work twice as hard as anyone else to gain even a fraction of the acceptance that others take for granted.
William felt a flicker of sympathy, but it was quickly overshadowed by the magnitude of what she had done. That doesn't justify systematically recording and sharing private family conversations, Camilla.
You've violated our trust in the most fundamental way possible. Camilla's eyes flashed with anger.
Trust? You want to talk about trust? I've given everything to this family. I've endured years of hatred and criticism to stand by your father's side. I've worked tirelessly to support the monarchy and fulfill my royal duties. And how am I repaid?
With suspicion and surveillance from my own stepson. The outburst revealed more than Camilla had probably intended.
William could see the years of resentment and frustration bubbling to the surface, but he also recognized the deflection tactic, turning herself into the victim rather than addressing the evidence of her betrayal. No one forced you to record private conversations, Camilla, William replied firmly. No one forced you to share intimate family details with journalists.
What? You made those choices yourself, and now you need to take responsibility for them. Camilla stood abruptly from the table, pacing to the window that overlooked the garden.
Her reflection in the glass showed a woman who suddenly looked older than her 76 years. When she turned back to face William, her expression had hardened into something almost defiant.
You think you understand what it's like to be me, but you have no idea, she said, her voice bitter. You were born into this family. You've never had to fight for your place or prove your worth.
I've had to claw my way into acceptance while being compared to a dead woman who's been elevated to sainthood.
The reference to his mother sent a surge of anger through William, but he forced himself to remain calm.
Leave my mother out of this, Camilla.
This isn't about the past or your struggles for acceptance. This is about your decision to betray our family's trust. Camilla laughed, but there was no humor in the sound.
Betray? I've done more to protect and promote this family than you realize.
Those conversations you're so concerned about? They helped me manage media relationships and ensure favorable coverage for the monarchy.
Oh.
Everything I did was to strengthen our position. William felt his control slipping slightly. By sharing details about my children's personal struggles? By discussing state matters that could compromise national security?
How exactly does that strengthen our position? Because knowledge is power, William, Camilla snapped. In this business, information is currency.
Those relationships I built, those conversations I documented, they gave me leverage to protect this family when we needed it most. The admission was stunning in its audacity. Camilla wasn't denying the recordings anymore. She was justifying them as necessary tools for protecting the monarchy. William realized that this confrontation was revealing aspects of his stepmother's character that he had never suspected. What about the conversation where you discussed my father's private concerns about government policy? William pressed. How does sharing state secrets protect the monarchy?
Camilla's defiance wavered slightly. That was taken out of context. I was simply confiding in a trusted friend about the pressures Charles faces as a new monarch.
A trusted friend who happens to be a journalist with the Times, William countered. We've identified several of your regular contacts, Camilla. These aren't casual friendships. They're professional relationships built on your access to inside information. The color drained from Camilla's face as she realized how thoroughly her activities had been uncovered. She returned to her seat at the table, her movements suddenly those of an elderly woman rather than the confident queen she had projected moments earlier.
What happens now? She asked quietly, all pretense of innocence finally abandoned.
William studied her carefully. Despite his anger and disappointment, he found himself feeling a complicated mix of emotions toward this woman who had become such a central figure in his father's life. She had indeed fought hard for acceptance and had faced enormous public criticism over the years, but that didn't excuse the systematic betrayal of trust that the recordings represented.
That depends entirely on you,
William said finally. These recordings represent a massive security breach and a fundamental violation of family trust. Some of them contain information that could be damaging not just to individual family members, but to the monarchy itself.
What do you want to keep you add discontent to imbibe unity?
Camilla looked up at him with an expression that mixed fear and calculation. What do you want from me?
William had spent the afternoon preparing for this moment.
His response would determine not just Camilla's fate, but potentially the future stability of his father's reign and the monarchy itself.
I want the truth, Camilla!
All of it. I want to know everyone you've shared information with, every recording you've made, and every conversation you've had about our family's private affairs.
I want to teach her a big gun.
And I want to know why you thought this was acceptable behavior for someone in your position. Camilla was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed again. The defiance and anger were gone, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. It started small, she began quietly. Just casual conversations with people I trusted. But over time, I realized that these relationships could be useful. The media coverage improved, and I felt like I finally had some control over my public image. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts before continuing. The recording device was my idea. I wanted to have accurate records of these conversations to protect myself if anything was ever taken out of context. But gradually, it became something more. I started documenting everything because I felt like I needed insurance. Insurance against what? William asked. Camilla's smile was bitter. Against being cast aside again. Against being blamed if something went wrong. Against losing everything I'd worked so hard to achieve. The vulnerability in her admission struck William unexpectedly. Despite everything she had done, he could see the frightened woman beneath the royal facade. Someone who had never felt truly secure in her position despite decades of effort. But understanding her motivations didn't excuse her actions. The recordings represented a betrayal that went to the very heart of the royal family's ability to function as both a private family and a public institution.
Who else knows about the recordings? William asked.
No one, Camilla replied quickly. I was the only one who knew about the device.
Some of the people I spoke with received transcripts of specific conversations, but they believed I was simply sharing information voluntarily. William felt a moment of relief. If the recordings themselves hadn't been distributed, there might be a chance to contain the damage. But there were still enormous challenges ahead.
Camilla, you understand that this can't continue, William said firmly. These activities have to stop immediately, and we need to assess the full extent of any damage that may have been done. Camilla nodded slowly.
I understand. But William, you have to believe that everything I did was motivated by my desire to protect and strengthen this family.
I may have made poor choices, but my intentions were never malicious. William wanted to believe her. But trust, once broken, wasn't easily repaired. The woman sitting across from him had revealed herself capable of deception and manipulation on a scale that he was still struggling to comprehend. What we believe about your intentions is less important than what you actually did, William replied. The recordings exist. The conversations happened. The trust has been broken. Now we need to figure out how to move forward.
As the afternoon sun continued its descent toward the horizon, casting ever longer shadows across the dining room, William realized that this confrontation was far from over. They had established the basic facts, and Camilla had finally admitted to her role in creating the recordings.
But the real work of determining the consequences and charting a path forward was just beginning. The weight of the situation pressed down on William as he considered the implications for his father, for the monarchy, and for his own family's future.
Dr. K-Room, substance has prevented mortars from visiting a work and journey.
The woman across from him was no longer just his stepmother or the queen consort. She was someone who had proven herself capable of systematic deception. And that changed everything about how they would need to interact going forward. Outside, the October evening was settling over London. But inside Clarence's house, the conversation that would determine the future of the British monarchy was far from finished. King Charles III stood in the study of Buckingham Palace, his weathered hands gripping the back of his leather chair as he stared at the documents spread across his desk. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in this moment, as he absorbed the devastating revelations about the woman he loved. The afternoon light filtering through the tall windows seemed harsh and unforgiving, casting sharp shadows across the evidence of Camilla's betrayal.
This is very expensive. As a result of this era did make man's betrayal to deliver the sound of the power. And it's beautiful to travel expeditiously and make the destroyers dependent on it.
William had delivered the news with the careful precision of someone who understood the magnitude of what he was revealing. For nearly 2 hours, father and son had sat in the same study where Charles had received news of his mother's death, where he had prepared for his coronation, where he had made countless decisions that would shape the future of the monarchy.
Demon Demonson prayed, will judge how which affected the uncertainties of monarchy.
Now they faced perhaps the most challenging decision of his reign.
Tell me again about the conversation where she discussed our private dinner with the German Chancellor, Charles said quietly, his voice hoarse with emotion and exhaustion. William reluctantly picked up one of the transcripts.
The recording is from last month. She was speaking with someone identified as James, who appears to be a political correspondent for the Telegraph. She shared details about your concerns regarding the European Union trade negotiations, including your opinion that the Prime Minister's approach was too aggressive.
Charles closed his eyes, remembering that evening clearly.
It had been a private dinner at Windsor Castle, just family members present. Camilla had seemed attentive and supportive as he shared his frustrations about the delicate balance required in international diplomacy. He had trusted her completely, as a husband trusts his wife, never imagining that his private thoughts were being documented for potential distribution to journalists. She shared my concerns about the Prime Minister's foreign policy positions with a newspaper correspondent, Charles said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. Do you understand what this means, William? These aren't just private family matters anymore. This touches on matters of state, on my relationship with the government.
William watched his father struggle with the implications, recognizing the profound pain in the older man's eyes.
Charles had waited decades to become king, had endured countless personal sacrifices for the crown, and had finally found happiness with a woman who now stood revealed as someone willing to exploit their most intimate moments for her own purposes.
There's more, Father, William said gently.
The recordings include several conversations where she discusses your health concerns, including your worries about the prostate surgery, and your fears about the future of the monarchy under your reign. Charles sank into his chair suddenly, looking every one of his 75 years. The betrayal wasn't just political or professional, it was deeply personal. Camilla had recorded and shared his most vulnerable moments, his private fears and insecurities that he had confided in her as his wife and closest companion.
How long has she been doing this? Charles asked.
The technical analysis suggests approximately 3 years, William replied. The recordings begin shortly after your accession to the throne. The timing stung even more than the betrayal itself.
Charles realized that Camilla had begun systematically documenting their private conversations almost immediately after he became king. Had she planned this from the beginning, or had the power and access that came with being queen consort corrupted her judgment over time?
A soft knock at the study door interrupted Charles's dark thoughts. His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, entered with the careful deference that royal staff had perfected over centuries of serving the monarchy.
Your Majesty, I apologize for the interruption, Sir Clive began. Her Majesty the Queen Consort is requesting an audience.
She says it's a matter of urgent family importance. Charles and William exchanged glances. They had been dreading this moment, the point at which Camilla would realize that her secret had been exposed and would attempt to manage the situation herself. Charles had no doubt that she would be prepared with explanations, justifications, and appeals to his emotions.
Tell Her Majesty that I will see her in 30 minutes, Charles replied. And Clive, I want you to ensure that we are not disturbed during our conversation. After Sir Clive departed, father and son sat in heavy silence. Charles stared at the portrait of his mother that hung above the fireplace, remembering her steady presence during countless crises.
Queen Elizabeth II had navigated scandals and challenges that had threatened the monarchy's survival, but she had never faced the prospect of the sovereign's own spouse working actively to undermine the institution from within.
What would you do, William? Charles asked finally.
If this were Catherine, if you discovered that your wife had been systematically betraying your trust and potentially damaging the monarchy, what would you do? William had been dreading this question, knowing that his answer could influence his father's decision about the future of his marriage and Camilla's role as queen consort. The parallels to his own situation were obvious but not entirely comparable.
Catherine had been born outside the royal family, but had embraced her role wholeheartedly from the beginning. Camilla's relationship with the monarchy had always been more complicated.
I think the question isn't what I would do, William said carefully. The question is what the monarchy requires. This isn't just about personal relationships anymore. This is about whether we can maintain the trust and confidence that the institution depends on.
Charles understood the diplomatic way his son was avoiding a direct answer, but he also recognized the wisdom in focusing on the institutional implications rather than the personal betrayal.
As monarch, Charles's personal happiness was secondary to the welfare of the crown and the nation it served.
The recordings could be used against us, Charles said, thinking through the strategic implications.
If Camilla has built relationships with journalists based on providing inside information, those relationships represent ongoing security risks.
Even if she stops recording conversations, the journalists will expect continued access to information. William nodded grimly. That's one of our biggest concerns. She's essentially created a network of media contacts who have come to rely on her for exclusive information about the royal family.
Cutting off that information flow could result in retaliatory coverage or pressure for her to continue sharing information.
The knock came precisely 30 minutes after Sir Clive's first announcement. Charles straightened in his chair, adjusting his tie in an unconscious gesture that William recognized as his father's way of preparing for difficult confrontations.
The dealer got that big deal in time.
When the door opened, Camilla entered with the composed dignity that had become her signature style, but William could see the tension in her shoulders and the careful way she was controlling her expression.
Charles, darling,
Camilla said warmly, approaching to kiss his cheek in their customary greeting.
William mentioned that you wanted to see me about something important. I do hope everything is all right.
Charles gestured for her to take the chair across from his desk, noting how her gaze briefly swept over the documents scattered across its surface.
Her ability to maintain composure in the face of what she surely knew was coming impressed him despite everything else.
Camilla, William has shared some concerning information with me, Charles began carefully. It appears that there have been some security issues involving your vehicle that we need to discuss. Camilla's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but years of marriage had taught Charles to read the subtle signs of her emotional state.
She was prepared for this conversation, which meant she had probably spent considerable time planning her response.
Yes, William mentioned something about a recording device. Camilla replied,
It's quite disturbing to think that someone has been spying on me. I assume the security team is investigating to determine who might be responsible for such an invasion of privacy.
Charles studied his wife's face, searching for any sign of the woman he thought he knew beneath the careful mask she was presenting. The ease with which she continued to maintain the fiction that she was a victim rather than a perpetrator was deeply unsettling.
Camilla, The investigation has revealed that the recording device was placed and operated with intimate knowledge of your routines and access to your vehicle, Charles said quietly. The technical evidence suggests that you were not just aware of the device, but were actively using it to record conversations. The silence that followed felt endless. Camilla's composed expression never wavered, but Charles could see her calculating her response. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of hurt bewilderment that might have been convincing if he hadn't already heard the evidence against her. "Charles, I'm shocked that you would suggest such a thing," she said. "Why would I possibly want to record my own conversations?"
The very idea is absurd. William reached for one of the folders on the desk.
"Camilla, we have transcripts of hundreds of hours of recordings."
We have technical evidence showing that the device was voice-activated to respond specifically to your speech patterns. We have documented proof that you shared confidential information about the royal family with multiple journalists. The weight of evidence was overwhelming, and Charles watched his wife's facade finally begin to crack. Her face flushed slightly, and for the first time since entering the room, she appeared genuinely uncomfortable.
"Even if such recordings existed," Camilla said carefully, "surely you understand that my conversations are private matters between myself and my friends. I hardly think casual social discussions warrant such intense scrutiny."
Charles felt a surge of disappointment that Camilla was still attempting to minimize and deflect rather than taking responsibility for her actions.
He reached for one of the transcripts that William had shown him earlier.
"This is a transcript from a conversation you had with a journalist from the Times," Charles said, his voice heavy with sadness. "In it, you share details about my private concerns regarding the government's approach to economic policy.
You discuss my health worries following recent medical procedures. You provide intimate details about William's children's personal struggles." He set the transcript down and looked directly at his wife. "These aren't casual social discussions, Camilla. These are systematic breaches of family trust and potentially matters of national security." Camilla's composure finally shattered completely. Her hands trembled as she reached for the water glass that Sir Clive had thoughtfully provided, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of desperation that Charles had never heard before. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under," she said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "For years, I've been vilified and criticized while trying to support you and fulfill my royal duties. The only way I could protect myself was by building relationships with people who could help manage my public image." Charles felt his heart breaking as he watched the woman he loved reveal the depths of her insecurity and desperation. But his sympathy was tempered by the recognition that her fears didn't justify the systematic betrayal of trust that the recordings represented.
Building relationships is different from secretly recording private conversations and sharing confidential information.
Charles replied gently, "Camilla, some of the conversations you recorded and shared contain information that could be damaging not just to our family, but to the monarchy itself." William cleared his throat softly. "Father, perhaps we should discuss the specific security implications. Some of the recordings contain information about state visits, diplomatic concerns, and government relationships that could be problematic if they were ever made public."
Charles nodded, recognizing that they needed to address the practical consequences rather than focusing solely on the personal betrayal. As monarch, his primary responsibility was to protect the institution of the crown, even when that conflicted with his personal feelings.
"Camilla, we need to understand the full scope of what you've done," Charles said firmly. "We need to know everyone you've shared information with, every recording you've made, and every conversation you've had that might have compromised the security or dignity of the monarchy."
Camilla wiped her eyes with the tissue that William quietly offered, her royal composure gradually returning even as she struggled with the emotions of being fully exposed.
"I kept records," she admitted quietly. "I have files documenting all the relationships I built and the information I shared. Everything was carefully managed to ensure that the monarchy benefited from positive coverage and strategic media relationships." The admission that she had kept detailed records of her activities was both helpful and deeply disturbing. It suggested a level of premeditation and organization that made her actions seem even more calculated and deliberate. "Where are these files?" William asked. "In my private office at Clarence House," Camilla replied. "They're secured in a safe that only I have access to." Charles and William exchanged glances, both recognizing the immediate need to secure these documents before they could be destroyed or used as leverage. The files represented both a potential treasure trove of evidence and a possible security nightmare if they contained more damaging information than they had already discovered.
Camilla, we're going to need access to those files immediately, Charles said.
We need to assess the full extent of any damage that may have been done and take appropriate steps to protect the monarchy's interests. Camilla's face went pale at the realization that her carefully maintained secret archives would now be exposed and scrutinized.
Charles, those files contain sensitive information.
If they were ever made public, that's exactly why we need to secure them, William interrupted. The existence of such files represents an ongoing security risk that we cannot ignore. The room fell silent as the full magnitude of the situation settled over them. Charles realized that he was facing not just a personal crisis, but a potential constitutional emergency. The Queen Consort had been conducting what amounted to espionage operations against the royal family, documenting and sharing information that could destabilize the monarchy if it ever became public.
What happens now? Camilla asked quietly, her voice small and vulnerable in a way that reminded Charles of the woman he had fallen in love with decades earlier.
Charles looked at his wife and his son, weighing the competing demands of his personal feelings, his responsibility as a monarch, and his duty to protect the institution that had been entrusted to his care.
The decision he made in the coming hours would determine not just the future of his marriage, but potentially the stability of the British monarchy itself.
That depends on what we find in those files, Charles replied slowly.
And it depends on whether you're finally ready to tell us the complete truth about what you've done.
Outside the study windows, the London evening was settling into darkness, but inside Buckingham Palace, the most challenging conversation in the history of the modern monarchy was far from over. The revelations of the afternoon had shattered the careful balance that Charles had worked so hard to achieve between his personal happiness and his royal duties.
Now he faced the possibility that the woman he loved might represent an existential threat to the very institution he had sworn to protect. The private office at Clarence House felt different in the dim light of early evening, its familiar elegance now carrying an ominous weight as Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews worked methodically to open Camilla's personal safe. The Queen Consort sat in silence on the burgundy leather sofa, flanked by William and King Charles, watching as the most secret aspects of her carefully constructed double life were about to be exposed. The safe itself was an impressive piece of German engineering, built into the wall behind an original Gainsborough painting that had belonged to the Queen Mother. Its existence wasn't secret. Most senior royals maintained private safes for important documents and valuables, but the contents were about to reveal the true scope of Camilla's systematic documentation of royal family secrets.
The combination is working, Sarah announced quietly, her voice breaking the tense silence.
I'm opening the safe now. Charles felt his stomach tighten as the heavy steel door swung open, revealing neat stacks of files, digital storage devices, and what appeared to be multiple mobile phones. The level of organization was immediately apparent. This wasn't the chaotic accumulation of someone who had stumbled into keeping secrets, but the methodical archive of someone who had been deliberately building an intelligence operation. Sarah began removing items systematically, wearing gloves and documenting each piece of evidence with photographs before placing them on the antique writing desk that dominated the center of the room. The first files she withdrew were labeled with names that Charles recognized: prominent journalists from major British newspapers, television presenters, and several individuals whose identities weren't immediately clear.
There are approximately 30 individual files, Sarah reported, plus several digital storage devices and 4 mobile phones that don't match any devices registered to Your Majesty's official accounts. William leaned forward to examine the file labels more closely. These names include political correspondents from The Times, The Telegraph, The Guardian, and the BBC.
There are also files for several people I don't recognize. Camilla spoke for the first time since they had arrived at Clarence House. Some of those files contain contact information for international journalists. I maintained relationships with correspondents from European newspapers and American publications as well.
The admission that her network extended beyond British media made Charles feel physically ill. The implications for international relations and diplomatic security were staggering.
If Camilla had been sharing sensitive information about state visits, diplomatic conversations, or international relationships with foreign journalists, the damage could extend far beyond the royal family itself.
Sarah opened the first file labeled Arb.
Harrison. Times. Inside were handwritten notes in Camilla's distinctive script, printed email exchanges, and what appeared to be transcripts of recorded conversations. The level of detail was extraordinary. Camilla had documented not just what information she had shared, but how the journalist had responded, what follow-up questions they had asked, and what kind of coverage had resulted from their conversations.
This file suggests a relationship going back nearly 4 years, Sarah observed.
The earliest entries predate Your Majesty's accession to the throne. Charles felt the revelation like a physical blow. Camilla had been building these relationships while he was still Prince of Wales, while they were still working to gain public acceptance for their marriage. While he had trusted her completely as his partner in preparing for kingship,
William picked up one of the transcript pages. This is a conversation from last Christmas.
She's sharing details about our family gathering at Sandringham, including private conversations about George's academic progress and Charlotte's concerns about public appearances.
The specificity of the information was breathtaking.
Camilla had recorded not just general impressions or casual observations, but precise details about conversations that had taken place during what the family considered their most private and sacred time together.
Sarah continued examining the files, each one revealing another layer of systematic information sharing.
The file labeled M. Davidson Telegraph contained evidence of regular communication about political matters, including Camilla's insights into Charles's private opinions about government policies and his relationships with various ministers. This conversation appears to have taken place the day after Your Majesty's meeting with the Prime Minister about the economic recovery package.
Sarah noted, reading from a transcript dated 3 months earlier.
Her Majesty shared details about your concerns regarding the proposed tax policies and your opinion that the Chancellor's approach was too conservative. Charles remembered that conversation vividly. It had been a confidential discussion with the Prime Minister about sensitive economic policies that could affect millions of British citizens. The fact that details of that meeting had been shared with a newspaper correspondent represented a potential breach of national security that went far beyond family privacy concerns.
How many of these files contain information about government matters?
William asked. Sarah continued her methodical examination. Based on a preliminary review, approximately half of them contain references to political discussions, diplomatic concerns, or matters that would typically be considered state business.
The body says everything is decided on the content of how it forms.
The scope of the security breach was becoming clear, and Charles felt the weight of his constitutional responsibilities pressing down on him. As monarch, he was required to maintain confidential relationships with government officials, foreign dignitaries, and other world leaders. If those individuals couldn't trust that their private conversations would remain confidential, his ability to fulfill his constitutional role would be severely compromised.
One of the digital storage devices caught William's attention.
Unlike the others, it was labeled with what appeared to be a date range covering the past 6 months. This device seems to contain more recent material.
Sarah connected it to a secure laptop that she had brought for the purpose of examining electronic evidence.
The screen filled with folder icons labeled by date and topic. One folder labeled Transition Plans immediately caught Charles's attention.
Open that one first,
he instructed quietly. The folder contained audio files and transcripts of conversations about the royal family's plans for the transition following Charles's eventual death. The discussions included detailed information about William's vision for modernizing the monarchy, concerns about public support for the institution, and private family conversations about how to handle the transfer of power. She was recording conversations about succession planning, William said, his voice tight with controlled anger. These are discussions about the future of the monarchy that were never intended to be documented. Charles felt a deep sense of betrayal as he realized that even their most sensitive family planning sessions had been secretly recorded.
What?
These weren't casual conversations that had been inadvertently captured, but deliberate documentation of strategic discussions that were crucial to the monarchy's future stability. Another folder labeled Health Concerns contained audio files of conversations about Charles's recent medical procedures, his concerns about his stamina for royal duties, and family discussions about contingency planning in case his health deteriorated more rapidly than expected.
This information could be used to destabilize confidence in the monarchy, Sarah observed.
If details about Your Majesty's health concerns were ever made public, it could affect everything from market confidence to international relations.
Camilla had remained silent throughout the examination of her files, but now she stood and walked to the window overlooking the garden. When she turned back to face the others, her expression had hardened into something approaching defiance.
Everything in those files was gathered to protect this family and strengthen the monarchy, she said. The relationships I built with journalists allowed me to influence coverage and ensure that the royal family was presented in the most favorable light possible.
William looked up from the transcript he was reading. By sharing details about our children's private struggles? By documenting conversations about state matters that could compromise national security? How exactly does that protect us? Camilla's composure cracked slightly. You don't understand the pressures I faced. Every day I had to prove myself worthy of this position. Every public appearance was scrutinized, every word analyzed. The only way I could ensure positive coverage was by building relationships with the people who control the narrative. Charles watched his wife struggle to justify her actions, recognizing the fear and insecurity that had driven her to such extreme measures. But understanding her motivations didn't excuse the systematic betrayal of trust that the files represented. Camilla, some of these recordings contain information that could be used to blackmail members of the royal family. Charles said quietly, "This isn't about managing public relations anymore. This is about whether you've created security vulnerabilities that could threaten the stability of the monarchy." Sarah held up another file, this one significantly thicker than the others. This file is labeled Insurance Policies and contains what appears to be the most sensitive material. The euphemistic title made Charles's blood run cold.
Insurance policies suggested that Camilla had been collecting information specifically for the purpose of protecting herself against future threats, possibly by threatening to release damaging information about the royal family. The insurance file contained transcripts of conversations that Charles immediately recognized as potentially devastating if they were ever made public.
There were recordings of family arguments, discussions about financial concerns, and private conversations about other royal family members that revealed unflattering opinions and personal conflicts.
This conversation is from last month, Sarah noted, reading from a transcript. It appears to document a private family discussion where various members expressed concerns about Prince Andrew's ongoing legal troubles and their potential impact on the monarchy's reputation. William felt his anger building as he realized the scope of Camilla's betrayal.
She hadn't just been sharing general information with journalists. She had been systematically documenting the royal family's most private and vulnerable moments, possibly for the purpose of using that information as leverage if her position were ever threatened. There are also recordings of conversations between their majesties that appear to contain very personal discussions about their relationship and future plans. Sarah continued carefully. Recognizing the sensitive nature of the material, Charles felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment. The idea that his most intimate conversations with his wife had been secretly recorded and filed away as potential insurance was almost too devastating to comprehend.
One of the mobile phones that Sarah had removed from the safe began buzzing with incoming messages. The screen showed multiple notifications from contacts identified only by initials, but the content of the visible messages made it clear that these were journalists expecting continued access to information.
She's been in regular contact with these people,
William observed, reading over Sarah's shoulder. They're asking about details of father's upcoming state visits and requesting information about family plans for the Christmas holidays. The realization that Camilla's journalist contacts were actively seeking information and expecting continued access to royal family secrets made the situation even more urgent.
Even if Camilla stopped sharing information immediately, the network she had built represented an ongoing security threat. Charles walked to the window where Camilla stood, looking out at the garden where they had spent so many peaceful evenings discussing their hopes and dreams for his reign. The woman standing beside him was still his wife, still the person he loved, but she was also someone who had been systematically betraying his trust for years. "How many people have access to this information?" Charles asked quietly. "The recordings themselves were only stored in devices I controlled," Camilla replied. "But I shared selected information with numerous contacts over the years. I don't have an exact count of how many people might have received specific details." The answer was deeply unsatisfying, suggesting that sensitive information about the royal family had been distributed to an unknown number of journalists and media contacts over a period of several years. The potential for ongoing damage was enormous. William joined them at the window carrying one of the files. "Camilla, this file contains information about Catherine's postpartum struggles after Louis's birth. These are deeply personal details that she shared with you in confidence during one of the most vulnerable periods of her life." The reference to his daughter-in-law's private struggles seemed to finally penetrate Camilla's remaining defenses. She turned away from the window, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I never intended for any of this to hurt the family," she said quietly. "Everything I did was motivated by my desire to protect and support the monarchy."
"I thought I was building relationships that would benefit all of us." Charles felt the familiar tug of sympathy for the woman he loved, but it was now tempered by the recognition that her actions had created a crisis that threatened the very foundation of his reign.
The discovery of the files and recordings had transformed what had begun as a security concern into a potential constitutional emergency. "The question now isn't about your intentions," Charles said firmly. "The question is about what we do with the knowledge that these files exist and that sensitive information about the royal family has been shared with an unknown number of media contacts."
Sarah finished her preliminary examination of the evidence and turned to address the royal family.
"Your Majesty, based on what we've discovered here tonight, I recommend that we conduct a comprehensive security assessment to determine the full scope of any potential damage. We also need to consider whether any crimes have been committed that would require police involvement. The suggestion that criminal charges might be appropriate sent a chill through the room. Charles realized that this crisis might extend beyond family relationships and media management into the realm of national security and criminal law. As the evening darkness settled over London, the revelation of Camilla's secret files had fundamentally changed the landscape of the British monarchy. The woman who had fought so hard to gain acceptance as queen consort now stood revealed as someone who had been systematically documenting and sharing the royal family's most private secrets. The decisions that Charles made in the coming hours would determine not just the future of his marriage, but the stability and security of the crown itself. The files spread across the antique writing desk represented more than evidence of betrayal. They were a roadmap of vulnerability that could be used against the royal family for years to come. And somewhere in London, an unknown number of journalists and media contacts were expecting continued access to information that could no longer be provided without compromising the very institution that Camilla claimed to have been protecting.
How often do they believe that this particular planned... The emergency meeting of the Privy Council convened at Buckingham Palace in the early hours of dawn, as London awakened to what would prove to be one of the most consequential days in modern British royal history.
King Charles III sat at the head of the mahogany table in the council chamber, flanked by the most senior advisors of the crown, while the evidence of Queen Camilla's systematic betrayal lay organized in neat folders before them.
Present were the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Chancellor, the private secretary to the sovereign, the director of the security services, and Prince William as heir to the throne. The gathering represented the highest levels of constitutional authority in the United Kingdom, convened to address a crisis that threatened the very foundation of the monarchy's ability to function, as both a symbol of national unity and a working institution of government.
The Lord Chancellor, Dame Margaret Thornberry, spoke first after the formal proceedings had been observed. Your Majesty, based on the evidence presented to us this morning, we are dealing with what can only be described as a systematic breach of Crown security that may have implications for national security. Charles had spent the sleepless night reviewing the full scope of Camilla's files with William and the security team. The picture that had emerged was even more damaging than their initial discoveries had suggested. The recordings and documentation revealed not just casual information sharing, but a sophisticated operation that had potentially compromised state secrets, diplomatic relationships, and the personal security of multiple royal family members. The recordings contained discussions about intelligence briefings that were shared with me by the heads of MI5 and MI6, Charles said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of constitutional responsibility.
Queen Camilla was present during some of these briefings and subsequently documented details about national security matters that were never intended to be shared outside the most restricted circles. William observed the gravity settling over the faces around the table as the full implications became clear. This was no longer simply a matter of family privacy or media management documentary.
When the Queen Consort had recorded and potentially shared information about intelligence operations, diplomatic negotiations, and security assessments, she had crossed into territory that could affect the safety and security of the entire nation. The Director of Security Services, Sir David Hamilton, consulted his notes before speaking.
Our preliminary assessment suggests that at least 12 separate conversations contained information that would be classified as state secrets under the Official Secrets Act. If any of this information has been shared with unauthorized individuals, including journalists, we may be dealing with violations of national security law.
The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, leaned forward with the moral authority that came with his position as the spiritual leader of the Church of England.
Your Majesty, we must also consider the constitutional implications of these revelations.
The Crown's ability to maintain the confidence of the government, parliament, and the people depends on absolute trust in the discretion and loyalty of the sovereign and the sovereign's immediate family.
Charles felt the weight of centuries of constitutional tradition pressing down on him.
The British monarchy had survived and adapted through countless crises over the centuries, but it had always depended on the fundamental principle that the crown could be trusted to place the interests of the nation above personal considerations. Camilla's actions had potentially shattered that trust in ways that could take decades to repair.
We've identified communications with journalists from foreign publications,
William added, sharing information from the overnight analysis.
The files show regular contact with correspondents from American newspapers and European magazines, suggesting that sensitive information about the British royal family and government may have been shared internationally.
The international implications made the situation even more grave.
The British monarchy served not just as a national institution, but as a symbol of the United Kingdom's soft power and diplomatic influence around the world.
If foreign media had been given access to insider information about British government policies or royal family relationships, The damage could extend to international relations and diplomatic credibility.
Dame Margaret consulted the legal brief that had been prepared during the night.
Your Majesty, we need to address several immediate concerns.
First, we must determine whether Queen Camilla's actions constitute criminal violations of the Official Secrets Act or other national security legislation. Second, we must assess the constitutional implications of these revelations for the Queen Consort's ability to continue in her role.
And third, we must develop a strategy for managing the potential damage to the crown and the government. Charles had been dreading this moment throughout the long night, knowing that the legal and constitutional analysis would inevitably lead to questions about Camilla's future as Queen Consort.
The woman he loved, the woman he had fought for decades to have accepted as his wife and partner, now posed a potential threat to the very institution she had worked so hard to join.
Sir David opened a classified folder that had been prepared by the intelligence services.
Based on our analysis of the communication patterns revealed in Queen Camilla's files, we believe that several ongoing intelligence operations may have been compromised. We're conducting urgent assessments to determine whether any sources or methods have been exposed.
The revelation that active intelligence operations might have been compromised sent a chill through the room. If Camilla's information sharing had led to the exposure of intelligence sources or methods, the consequences could include threats to individual agents, the loss of critical intelligence capabilities, and damage to the United Kingdom's relationships with allied intelligence services.
William felt compelled to speak on behalf of the broader royal family.
We must also consider the impact on other family members, particularly my children.
The recordings contain intimate details about their personal lives, their education, and their development that were never intended to be documented, much less shared with media contacts. The Archbishop nodded solemnly. The violation of family privacy is deeply concerning, but we must also recognize that this situation raises fundamental questions about trust and loyalty within the institution of the Crown itself.
Charles understood the delicate way that Archbishop Welby was approaching the constitutional crisis that Camilla's actions had created. The monarchy's legitimacy depended not just on public acceptance, but on the trust of the political establishment, the intelligence services, and the international community.
If the Queen Consort could not be trusted to maintain confidentiality and loyalty, her continued presence in that role could undermine the Crown's ability to function effectively.
The private secretary to the sovereign, Sir Clive Alderton, raised another critical concern.
Your Majesty, we must consider the ongoing security risks posed by Queen Camilla's network of media contacts.
These individuals will be expecting continued access to information, and if that access is suddenly terminated, they may become hostile or may attempt to pressure Her Majesty to resume sharing information.
The dynamic that Sir Clive had identified represented one of the most dangerous aspects of the crisis.
Camilla had essentially created a dependency relationship with numerous journalists who had come to rely on her for exclusive access to royal family information. Those relationships could now be used as leverage against her or against the royal family more broadly.
Dame Margaret presented the legal framework that would govern any formal response to the crisis. Under the Official Secrets Act, the unauthorized disclosure of state secrets is a criminal offense that can result in imprisonment. However, prosecuting the Queen Consort would create unprecedented constitutional complications that could damage the Crown more than the original violations.
Charles felt trapped between equally devastating options.
Allowing Camilla's violations to go unpunished would signal that the royal family was above the law and could undermine public confidence in the justice system. But prosecuting his own wife for national security violations would create a constitutional crisis that could threaten the stability of the monarchy itself. William recognized his father's anguish and attempted to focus the discussion on practical solutions. What are our options for managing this crisis while protecting both the integrity of the Crown and the security of the realm?
Sir David responded first from the security perspective.
We recommend that Queen Camilla be immediately removed from access to any classified information or state briefings. We also need to conduct comprehensive interviews to determine exactly what information was shared and with whom.
Subsequent reports of Trawley says to know about protecting Commission's bilateral and appropriate program that's produced in history.
The Archbishop added the constitutional dimension. The Church of England's position would be that the Queen Consort must demonstrate genuine repentance and take concrete steps to repair the damage she has caused. The coronation service included solemn vows about loyalty and service that appear to have been violated.
Dame Margaret outlined the legal options. We could pursue a path of administrative resolution rather than criminal prosecution.
What dim I identified do you want to see his time?
This would involve Queen Camilla formally acknowledging her violations, accepting restrictions on her future activities, and potentially stepping back from certain royal duties, Charles found himself facing the most difficult decision of his reign.
The recommendations from his advisors pointed toward a resolution that would allow Camilla to remain as his wife while significantly reducing her role as queen consort.
But even this compromise solution would require her to accept responsibility for actions she had been trying to justify as necessary for protecting the royal family.
Has Queen Camilla been informed about this meeting? The Archbishop asked. She knows that we're reviewing the security implications of the discoveries, Charles replied.
But she hasn't been told about the specific constitutional concerns that have been raised.
William leaned forward.
Father, I think we need to consider not just the immediate crisis, but the long-term implications for the monarchy's credibility.
The public's trust in the royal family has been earned over decades of faithful service. If it becomes known that the queen consort systematically violated that trust, the damage could last for generations. The weight of William's words settled over the room. Each person present understood that the decisions made in the coming hours would shape the trajectory of the British monarchy for decades to come.
Dying accepted power will depend on the meaning of the numbers of parties.
The institution that had survived wars, scandals, and social upheaval now faced a crisis of trust from within its own ranks. Charles stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace courtyard, where the morning tourists were already gathering to watch the changing of the guard. These people believed in the dignity and integrity of the royal institution. They trusted that the crown represented the highest standards of public service and moral leadership. The revelation of Camilla's systematic deception could shatter that trust in ways that might never be fully repaired. I need to speak with Queen Camilla before we proceed with any formal decisions, Charles announced. She deserves the opportunity to explain her actions and to understand the consequences of what she has done. The Lord Chancellor nodded.
Your Majesty, we recommend that any such conversation be conducted with appropriate safeguards to ensure that it cannot be recorded or used to further compromise the Crown's interests. The irony of needing to take precautions against being recorded by his own wife was not lost on Charles.
The crisis had fundamentally altered not just his relationship with Camilla, but the basic trust that had formed the foundation of their marriage and partnership.
Sir David made one final recommendation.
Your Majesty, regardless of how you choose to handle the personal and constitutional aspects of this crisis, we strongly recommend that Queen Camilla be immediately suspended from all activities that involve access to classified information or sensitive government business. The practical implications of this recommendation meant that Camilla would be excluded from state dinners involving foreign leaders, intelligence briefings, and confidential government consultations.
It would represent a dramatic reduction in her role as queen consort, one that would be noticed by the public and the media despite any efforts to manage the situation discreetly.
As the Privy Council meeting concluded, Charles felt the full weight of the crown pressing down on him. The woman he loved had betrayed not just his personal trust, but the trust of the nation she had sworn to serve. The coming conversation with Cam,